All right, so that should start recording here in just a moment. And let's look at chapter 5. That's going to be our tissues. So chapter 5, tissues. I just updated this PowerPoint. So it's going to have all the most recent information. You coming in or not? Anyways, okay, so tissues. You may have seen this slide before. All right, when we're talking about tissues, we've now taken those cells that we just got done learning about, and we are going to organize them into much more complex units, because not only are we dealing with just the cells, now we're going to deal with some of the stuff that's outside the cells, or what we call the extracellular material. And a lot of these tissues are going to have a common function. It could be secretion, absorption, filtration, protection. All right. So when we study these tissues, we call the study of tissues histology. You may have heard me refer to it as histo. Right? That is the study of tissues. So keep in mind that tissues have a common function. It's made up of cells, and then what we call extracellular material. That's the stuff outside the cell. If I haven't emphasized this enough, and I say this somewhat jokingly, right, these 4 tissue types, you should be able at this point to be able to rattle off top of your head: epithelial, connective, muscle, nervous. Boom. All right. So we're going to go through a quick review of all of these, right, with a little bit more detail and some other things that I didn't really get a chance to talk about in the lab. So let's start off with our first tissue type, epithelium. You'll hear me go back and forth between the terms epithelium and epithelial tissue. All right, but this is going to be that tissue that we've seen that's either going to be one single layer or multiple layers, 2 or more layers. And we'll get into the naming aspect again. All right, but what we really see are the cells are closely packed with one another. Closely packed, which is quite different than when we're looking at certain types of the connective tissue, which is the second type of tissue in our body. All right, in addition to them being tightly packed, think about it. If these cells are tightly packed, there's not going to be a lot of room on the outside of these cells for stuff, that extracellular matrix. So epithelium contains either very little to no extracellular matrix because of that quality of them being tightly packed. And therefore, all right, when we look at epithelial tissue, since there's little to no extracellular matrix, that means we don't have a lot of space to bring in blood vessels. So that means our epithelium is going to be avascular. Okay, no blood supply. So we'll see this, and we've already talked about some of these areas. We'll see it, lining some of the surface of our body. We talked about that with chapter 6, the cutaneous membrane, which is the integument system, right? That is made, the outermost layer, the epidermis, is made up of epithelial tissue. We'll also see it that lines our body cavities. We saw that with the serous membranes. And then we did mention briefly when we were talking about glands, all right, that the glands are going to be made up of epithelial tissue, because at one point, and I mentioned this briefly, that during the development stage, right, at one point, parts or certain parts of the epidermis there, the outermost layer, when you're developing it as a fetus, some of that epithelial tissue will invaginate itself into the deeper layer or areas of the fetus there, and that epithelial tissue is destined to become, well, some of it will become glands. All right, so some of the characteristics of epithelial tissue. Now, I didn't really touch on this in too much detail in lab, right? But what we're seeing, all right, one is when we say cellularity, all right, what we're talking about is, all right, the fact that these cells are tightly packed, all right, and when you look at them on a slide, you're going to see pretty much just cells. All right, so we get that characteristic, that tight packed quality or characteristic, we call that cellularity. Virtually no extracellular matrix that we will find outside in between these cells. And so when we're looking at the cells, all right, when we're discussing certain aspects of the cells of epithelial tissue, all right, the characteristic of polarity, basically we're assigning, a top to the cell, a bottom to the cell, and a side to the cell. All right, so when we talk about the apical surface of the cell, what we're doing is we're talking about the top portion of the cell. All right, and that's going to be, all right, the part that's going to be exposed, if we're talking about the epidermis, to the external environment. or if we're talking about one of our serous membranes or layers there, it could be an internal body space there. And the apical surfaces will have those modifications. All right, the cilia that we've talked about, which is those hair-like structures that move things past the cell, and the microvilli, which are extensions of the plasma membrane, usually out into a lumen or space of some sort, which increases the surface area of the cell, which increases absorption for the cell. All right, the bottom portion, that's the basal surface. That sits here at the bottom of the cell. And that basal surface, especially if we're talking about, all right, simple epithelium, the basal surface of that one single cell layer is going to attach, all right, to the connective tissue below. All right, actually it attaches to the basement membrane, but that basement membrane sits on that connective tissue below. And then because of that tight, packed quality of cellularity there for these cells, the lateral surfaces of these cells, the sides here, since they're so tightly packed, all right, they're going to form, all right, these intercellular junctions, which allow the cells to form these relationships with one another in which they're firmly held in place like these connections. All right, so like I said before, all of the epithelial tissue or the bottommost layer is going to attach to a basement membrane. All right, again, our epithelium is avascular, no blood vessels, so it has to get its nutrition. Can you close that door? Thanks. What was is that the cells in the epithelial tissue then have to get their nutrients and get rid of their waste via diffusion. That's because there's blood vessels in close proximity, usually in that connective tissue there. All right, one thing I have not mentioned about epithelial tissue is that it is rich with nervous innervation. Okay, so you have these nerve receptors that are going to be just all over the place. All right, and so again, that allows for sensory input into the nervous system there. So in case something changes in both the internal environment of the body or the external environment of the body, all right, our nervous system is aware of it, and our control center can make the much needed alterations and changes, all right, depending on what those changes are in the environment. We talked about this in lab class for chapter 6 about how when we were talking about the epidermis there, the bottommost layer, that stratum basale there, that layer is constantly, the cells there are constantly dividing. And so epithelial tissue has this high regeneration capacity, all right, because the cells in the epithelial tissue, especially if it's a stratified epithelium, right, those outer cells can slough off. They can get damaged or they can just slough off, all right? So to replace that, we will see in the deeper cell layers, all right, of the epithelium, we will see that those cells are constantly or frequently undergoing mitosis. Remember, mitosis is cellular division of somatic cells. The somatic cells are pretty much all the cells in the body except your sex cells, which is sperm in males and oocytes or the eggs in females. So here we can see a couple of the qualities or characteristics of our epithelial cells here. All right, when we're talking about cellularity, here's the apical surface, the basilar surface is on the bottom, then we have our lateral surfaces where we're forming our tight junctions there. And then you can see that the basal surface makes contact with the basement membrane. Then deep to that, we'll see our connective tissue. All right, some functions of epithelial tissue now. We just got done talking about the characteristics. Let's talk about the functions. Okay, we learned about, a lot of the characteristics and the different types of epithelium when we were covering it in chapter 5 for lab, but now we're going to give you a little bit more to go on when we're talking about functions. So when we get into each individual specific type of epithelial tissue, right, I can touch on the functions. You'd be like, oh yeah, all right, I see that now. I see how that function it works for that type of epithelium. So the first type of function is physical protection, right? And if you notice here, and you might not, you can see here that the physical protection offers protection from dehydration, abrasion, and destruction. Well, gosh darn it, that's what some of the functions for your skin are, to protect against dehydration, water loss, or abrasion, any type of, if something comes in contact with your skin, and just general overall destruction of the tissues underneath. So Epithelial tissue, depending on where it's found, is going to protect either the inside or the outside surfaces of your body. All right. Nice thing about this type of epithelium is that it is selectively permeable, similar to what we learned that concept with the plasma membrane. It'll let certain substances cross, and it will prevent the crossing of others. So that can be very helpful. So therefore, we give it the nickname, these are the gatekeepers. We saw the secretions before, all right, because a lot of this type of tissue is going to be found in our endocrine and exocrine glands, which I'll go over here in a little bit detail in a moment here. All right, and then we talked about some of the sensations, because when this type of tissue is richly innervated, all right, we're going to see that then that its rich innervation will allow for sensory input to the control center or the central nervous system here. But we have specialized epithelium that helps with that, in which we call the neuroepithelium. All right, and we saw, all right, some of the cells there before when we were studying the skin. All right, the Merkel cells. All right, those are the cells that are found in the basal, the stratum basale, the deepest layer of the epidermis. And we'll see that when that cell is compressed, it releases chemicals which will stimulate receptors that are close by into creating sensory input into the control center or your central nervous system there. Okay, so let's quickly review how we classify epithelial tissue. And again, there's two components to this. First is the number of cell layers, and second is the shape of the cell. So a quick review: if there is one cell layer thick, and obviously all those cells will make contact with the basement membrane below, we call it simple. And so we're going to see, and this is important when we're talking about the function of this type of epithelium, we'll see it for filtration, absorption, or secretion. And I'll show you that as we go through, all right, the specific epithelial tissue here in a moment. All right, stratified obviously is going to be two or more, so only the bottommost layer will make contact with the basement membrane. Now we'll see this type of tissue, all right, in areas that are going to undergo a lot of physical stresses, mechanical stress, right? The soles of your feet, the palms of your hand, your mouth, all right, your cheeks, inside your mouth, your esophagus, the anus, the vagina, right? So we'll see, right, in these areas where we'll have many layers of cells. Also, stratified epithelium will also offer structural support. We'll see it around ducts to cells, ducts to, I'm sorry, not cells, to the endocrine or glands. Sorry, I'm dying here because that is spelled wrong and it's bothering me. So you'll have to forgive me. Okay, and obviously protection. Okay, so pseudostratified epithelium, this is one of those exceptions, right? It looks like, obviously, you know the name, pseudo, false. So this here, this type of epithelium looks like it has several layers to it, right? But it doesn't. Not all the cell layers make it to the apical surface, okay? Or all the cells make it to the apical surface, but all of them do contact the basement membrane. All right, so now when we're talking about the other component to naming or classifying our epithelial tissue, we've got to talk about, all right, the shapes. Okay, so we have our squamous cell, that's the flattened cell with the flattened nucleus, looks like a fried egg or a tile. Then we've got our cuboidal cells, that's the cell that it's as tall as it is wide, okay, and the nucleus is right in the center, and it has a spherical shape. And then we have our columnar cells. Those are the cells that are as tall as they are wide. And the nucleus will be found at the basal or bottom portion of the cell, and it'll be oval shaped. And then the final type of cell shape is the transitional cells. Remember, that's the transformer cell, all right? And it changes shape dependent on what's happening to that epithelium. If it's getting stretched, it'll be flat. If it's not being stretched and it's recoiled and relaxed, then it'll have more of a rounded polyhexanal appearance. All right, we'll talk about that when we get into the transitional epithelium. All right, so here's that picture that we saw before, okay? And just to remind you, when we're dealing with stratified epithelium, when we're naming it, we're always naming it for the cells at the apical surface, what they look like. Doesn't matter what the basal surface looks like. Okay, it's always apical. All right, you by now should be very familiar with this figure. Okay, figure 5.3. Right, it's a nice way to help break down, all right, the types of epithelium, okay, and some of the basic qualities of that epithelium. So what I would really strongly urge you is to know everything on this figure here. All right, and a lot of you probably already know it. You know, when you see simple, you know, okay, that's one layer of cells. So again, you just want to go through some of the reminders here, just to make sure that you are pretty much up to date and you're very familiar with that epithelium. Okay, so simple squamous epithelium. All right, I'm gonna assume that you all know that when I say simple, you know how many cell layers are present, and when I say squamous, you know what the shape of the cell is. All right, because we just talked about that just a moment ago. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on where you're going to find this type of epithelium and the functions. So simple squamous truly is, I mean, they're flattened cells and they're one single cell layer thick. So it is pretty much the thinnest barrier possible that you could find in the body for the most part. Okay. So, and it's good because we want to have a thin barrier when we need to have certain functions like filtration. Okay. So a perfect example is when we're trying to get, all right, oxygen and carbon dioxide to move across from the blood into the air sacs in your lungs, the alveoli, and vice versa, we want the thinnest possible barrier. Okay. Because one, we can get a much quicker exchange of gases. All right. It's much more efficient. Okay. And so therefore, every breath you're taking is going to be well worth it because you're oxygenating and getting rid of a lot of carbon dioxide with every breath. So that rapid movement is going to be priceless. So therefore, we're going to put in our thinnest barrier there. We'll also see it in capillaries because capillaries are going to be found in tissues, all right, where there needs to be and you'll learn this more in detail in 211, okay? But capillaries are going to be found in tissues, and tissues again need to get nutrients and get rid of their waste, just like anything else, because their cells need nutrients and they need to get rid of their waste. So think of capillaries, or what we call capillary beds, exchange sites. Okay, we are dumping off oxygen into these cells, and we're picking up carbon dioxide, or we're picking up urea, or we're offering glucose. Okay, so the lining of the blood vessels, or the vessels that are in these areas, you want it to be thin so things can move across and migrate with relative ease. All right, same thing here with our serous membranes too. All right, we talked about the serous membranes that are found around the heart, around the lungs, all right, around a lot of your organs. All right, so be familiar with these functions and where you're going to find that type of epithelium there. The next type of simple epithelium is cuboidal. Okay, so these here, again, you're going to see, we already know the shape of the cell, right? Nice and square-like, all right, or cube shaped with a nice rounded nucleus in the center. Okay, so we're going to see this type of epithelium for absorption and secretion. So when we're thinking of absorption and secretion, think of the kidneys. Okay, the kidneys are just going to filter the blood, and they're going to keep some things and dump it back into the blood while getting rid of other things and putting it into the urine. So it's filtering out the blood, right? And so that's wonderful. When we get to secretion, think of glands. All right, and so when we're thinking of the glands, a perfect example like the thyroid gland. Okay, we have glandular epithelium as one of our slides in lab. And so the thyroid gland needs to make thyroxine, and then it needs to export it into our bloodstream so it can get all over the place. All right, some of our sweat glands, okay, you're going to see the ducts, especially, which are those tubes that are going to conduct the secretions, right? So the lining of those ducts, okay, are going to be filled with this type of epithelium, and it'll help transmit the secretions to the epithelial surface, which is what we want in the first place. All right, the last type of, well, I should say the last type, but one of the last types of simple epithelium is the columnar epithelium. Again, here's the shape of the cell, nice and tall, all right, and then the nucleus will be at the bottom, okay? And so again, we're going to see that this type of epithelium is great for secretion and absorption. Similar similar to how our simple cuboidal epithelium was. All right, so there's two forms, non-ciliated, so we already know what that means. If it's non-ciliated, it means it has no cilia, okay? And then there's ciliated. So our non-ciliated is going, since it has no cilia, it's therefore going to have microvilli. We know what microvilli are, okay? Just these small little, all right, projections upward from the top of the apical surface of the cell. So only columnar cells can be ciliated. No, that's a great question. For this course, that's what we're going to talk about. Okay, you're going to find out that you can have some cuboidal cells that can be, have cilia on them. Okay, but for this course right now, all right, we're only going to deal with the cuboidal. I know it's like, hey, what the heck? But be honest with you, when you get into the kidney tubules, you'll learn that some of those cells will have microvilli, well, cilia-shaped projections going on. Thank you. Keep in mind, remember, there's always exceptions to the rule. Not in every situation, but there's always exceptions to the rule. Okay, so since we have microvilli, all right, and when we're looking at it under a microscope, we'll describe it as a brush border because it looks like the top of the cell is nice and fuzzy. All right, but we'll notice in this epithelium, we have our first type of gland, and that's our goblet cells. And that's a unicellular gland, which means one cell. It makes the mucin. And when that mucin mixes with water, it turns into mucus, which is wonderful because we need mucus, especially in the digestive tract for lubrication. Okay, because remember, we're dealing with simple epithelium, very thin layer. So we need to lubricate the heck out of it. So we're not damaging that epithelium. It plays a huge role. All right, so we're pretty much going to see this epithelium pretty much from your stomach all the way down to the anus. And if you think about it, because what did I say about simple columnar epithelium? Its functions are absorption and secretion, and we're seeing exactly those two functions here. The goblet cells take care of the secretion, okay, and then our non-ciliated columnar epithelium with the microvilli takes care of the absorption. So it works out wonderfully. All right, our other type of simple columnar epithelium is the ciliated. So we'll see the cilia again on the apical surface, and if we're going to have cilia there, then we need that cilia to move stuff. So what's it going to move? Well, goblet cells will help with that. Goblet cells will help to produce the mucin. So we'll see this type of epithelium in your bronchioles, all right, and we'll also see it, okay, in the uterine tube. And I mentioned this before because the cilia help to sweep the oocyte towards the uterus from the ovaries. Because the oocyte or the egg does not have any means of propulsion. It's not like a sperm. Sperm's got a tail. Okay, so the oocyte needs help. It doesn't know. It's just it's like a hot air balloon. It's at the mercy of the current, the wind currents. Well, in this case, all right, our oocyte's at the mercy of the cilia beating in the direction of the uterus, and so it sweeps it down. And so it's got no choice. It's like a current of a river. It's just going to go downstream. All right, so the last type that we're throwing into the simple epithelium is the pseudostratified. Okay, again, we already know. It looks like it's stratified. It's not. All the cells make contact with the basement membrane, but not all the cells make it to the apical surface. So this appearance, you'll see these staggered nuclei all over the place, and so it gives it the appearance of that stratified layer. All right, so there's two forms. Again, ciliated, non-ciliated. All right, so our ciliated, again, is going to have cilia on the apical surface, but again, we have to move something, and so we'll have goblet cells for the mucin to make the mucus. So it's going to offer, in this situation, protective functions. And I'll explain to you why it does that. First, we're going to find it in the large passageways of the respiratory system. So pretty much in the upper respiratory tract, that's pretty much going to be lined with the ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Right? Your nasal cavity, all over the place. Part of the pharynx there, part of your trachea, well, not part of the trachea, all right, part of your voice box or the larynx. And then even where the trachea bifurcates and splits off, it's going to line the bronchi. So that's going to be your larger passageways for the respiratory system. And its protective mechanism is because of all that mucus that's being produced, right, from those goblet cells, it's going to trap foreign particles. Okay, which is good, especially if you live in an urban area where there's a higher pollution. What was it over there in Beijing? The pollution is so bad over there, people have to wear masks pre-COVID. Okay, because the pollution was that bad. So you better believe that their respiratory membranes, right? This area, the ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium, was constantly being taxed, all right, because for all that mucus production because of the pollutants there. All right, and then the last type of our simple is going to be the non-ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. This is the rare. It's got nothing. I think of it as being rare, so it's like, I don't want to say poor, but if it's rare, it doesn't have a lot to it. So it has no cilia, and it does not have goblet cells. Okay, so it does have a protective function, right? And we'll see this in the male urethra and the epididymis. Again, it's rare, so we don't really talk about it too much. Okay, so that was the simple epithelium. Let's look at our stratified epithelium, starting off with our stratified squamous epithelium. Again, I already assumed that you know what that means. 2 or more layers, okay? And so keep in mind, this we saw with stratified squamous epithelium, we saw that when we started talking about the integument, the skin, right, and the epididymis. And we saw that those deeper cells had a different shape than the apical cells. All right, but again, we name it after the apical cells. So in this type of epithelium, we'll see it. It's going to offer that protection again. Okay, so our epidermis helps to protect from friction and abrasive mechanical stresses. And that bottommost layer, that makes contact with the basement membrane, right, is that layer that is constantly regenerating, excuse me, because we're pushing those cells up to the superficial area, all right, and then those outer cells slough off, so we have to replace them. So there's 2 types, keratinized and non-keratinized. Remember, keratin kills. Keep that in mind. So this is that protein, all right, that yes, it makes the cell strong like bull, okay, but in doing so, it's killed off the organelles and the nuclei. Think about it. As the cell starts to fill up with that protein, it's going to start to kill off the organelles. Well, that's like if we were started to destroy your internal organs, what do you think would happen to you? You would die. Same thing happens to your cell. All right, so once the organelles are destroyed and the nuclei, the control center is done, then the cell's dead. Okay, so these cells will be found on the superficial, the top layers there. Whereas on the bottom layers, those will be the newly regenerating cells, the younger cells that are eventually going to migrate up into the superficial areas there. All right, so we find this, we already talked about this before, in the epidermis, the outer layer of your skin. All right, the other type of stratified squamous is the non-keratinized. Okay, so if it's non-keratinized, that means it's alive. Number 5 is alive. If you've ever seen, I can't remember, it was an 80s movie, and it had the robot Johnny 5. Steve Gutenberg was in it, and I can't remember, Ali somebody was in it. For those of you that are older than 40, you probably know what I'm talking about. It'll come to me. Anyways, so think of this type of keratin in areas that are going to be moist. So your mouth, okay, your the vagina, the anus, the esophagus, all right, parts of your throat, okay, the pharynx, and again, the larynx. Does someone know? Short Circuit, thank you. Yes, yes. And they made a sequel to it called Short Circuit 2. So it was on TV not too long ago, and I actually watched part of it. Okay, so again, These cells are going to be found in areas that you're going to have, that are going to be moist, right? No keratin. So all the cells are going to be living. Hopefully they should be. All right. So therefore you'll be able to see the cell nuclei there. And so again, you'll see it in your mouth. Okay. Parts of the pharynx, which are going to be parts of your throat, the esophagus, the vagina, and the anus. All right, the next type of stratified epithelium is going to be cuboidal, our nice square-shaped cells. And again, we'll see these around the tubes and coverings of some of these structures, right? Some of the glands, all right? And we'll also see it in your ovaries, okay? So their role is going to be for protection and secretion, right? So again, whenever you see secretion, you should be thinking glands. And so we're going to see them, all right, forming these cells are going to help form the walls of the ducts of the exocrine glands there. So your sweat glands, all right, you'll see this also for support. Okay, and then also we'll see it on the outer edges of the ovaries there around the ovarian follicles. And an ovarian follicle is basically a structure that is going to hold an egg, an oocyte. Okay, think of it like a house. Well, it's not that big, so like an apartment, a studio apartment with one person living inside. The person is the oocyte, the apartment is the follicle. All right, and then not our last type of epithelium here, but our stratified columnar epithelium. Again, we have another rare type. All right, so we're going to see this in areas of secretion and protection. Okay, so again, if we're thinking about secretion, we're thinking about salivary glands. And then we'll also see it, because it's rare, around parts of the male urethra there. Which leads me to the last type of epithelium, which is the transitional epithelium. Our transitional epithelium is that transforming epithelium. So we're pretty much going to see it in the urinary system, in our urinary tract there. All right, we talk a lot about the bladder. All right, so we'll see this epithelium in the urinary bladder. And so when the bladder is full, okay, it'll be stretched. So the apical cells will have a flattened appearance to it. So they'll look like they're squamous. And then when the bladder is empty, okay, the apical cells will be nice and rounded on the top, and the basal cells will have more of a square kind of geometrical shape to it. And these cells are binucleated. So you'll see one cell with two nuclei. So you can kind of see that here. All right, here's the bladder empty, so the apical cells will be nice and rounded, and the basilar cells, the ones that are closer down here, all right, they'll have that kind of cuboidal or polyhedral shape to them. And you'll have to, I can't zoom in anymore, but you can see that some of these cells will have two nuclei in them. Now, when the bladder's full, okay, the apical cells get pushed down flat, and they have more of a flattened or that squamous shape appearance to them. Okay, so keep in mind, this is a very important slide. You should burn this into your memory, okay? Just keep in mind that simple epithelium, great for absorption, secretion, or diffusion. Stratified, physical protection, all right, like supporting, okay? So easy to remember, keep it in your mind. All right, so since we're talking about epithelium, let's quickly review the glands. This slide should look familiar to you. I did show it to you before, okay? So when we're talking about glands, we can either be talking about structures that are one cell or many. All right, obviously it's made up of epithelial tissue because that's why we're talking about it here. We just talked about epithelium. Okay, so glands make things. All right, we know that the goblet cell makes mucin, which is going to make mucus. All right, we know that your adrenal glands make hormones. Your thyroid gland is going to make hormones. Okay, so we have glands that make hormones that you will study in this course. All right, we're going to have glands that are going to create enzymes. That's great. When we get to the digestive system, we have to break things down. All right, so there's two types of glands, endocrine and exocrine. Okay, endocrine you'll talk more about in chapter 17. All right, but those do not have ducts. So they're going to make their chemicals, their hormones, and they're going to dump it into the blood or into the interstitial fluid. Basically, they're going to just dump whatever they're making outside of the cells that are making it or outside of the tissue. It'll find its way eventually into the blood. Could be directly into the blood, or it could go into the interstitial fluid and then eventually make it into the blood. Exocrine glands are what we're going to talk here today, now. All right, exocrine glands are that epithelium that I was telling you about during development, right, which was living on the surface of the fetus there. It invaginates in and pushes in, and it winds up into some of the deeper layers below. In fact, it goes all the way down into the connective tissue, right, in our skin, in the dermis there. But it keeps a connection to the epithelial surface there via a duct. So the part of the gland that secretes is down in the connective tissue, and then the duct travels all the way through the connective tissue up to the epithelial surface, so the secretions can make it onto the epithelial surface there. So our exocrine glands, we're going to talk about these different types of glands here in a moment, but some examples are sweat glands, right? The mammary glands that are found in the breasts, and then the salivary glands. So again, all right, our unicellular exocrine glands, all right, there's exceptions to the rule. I remember what we said, exocrine glands have a duct, but wait a minute, Dr. Kaz, unicellular exocrine glands do not have a duct. Well, they don't need it because they're so close to the surface of the epithelial surface there, of the epithelium, they don't need it, okay? So we still lump it in because of the epithelial tissue that it's made up of. Okay, so of course we talked about the goblet cell. Now we're going to talk about our multicellular exocrine glands. So to do that, all right, we're going to talk about the two parts of a gland. There's the acini, or it's kind of like a bulge or rounded area of the gland. I describe it as a grape, and that's the part of the gland that makes stuff. And then you have the tube that stuff that was made is going to travel through to get to the surface of the epithelium. Okay, and we call that the duct. All right, so these glands are going to be surrounded, all right, by a capsule. And you're going to find, and I've mentioned this before, especially when we're talking about the connective tissue, all right, that some of the organs in your body, like your kidneys, the liver, have a capsule around it. Some of like your lymph nodes, they have a capsule surrounded, right? So structures and glands are going to be included in this, all right, can have a fibrous capsule, all right, this coating that goes around, and then parts of that capsule are going to extend into the deeper portion of the gland. And basically what it'll do is it'll separate the gland. It'll make these little partitions, all right, we call those septa. All right, and the septa, all right, are going to section off the gland into what we call lobes, chunks. I would try to draw it for you, but I got a picture to do that. All right, so that's what we see here. So we're basically breaking it down here, the two parts of the gland. You have the secretory portion, that's called the acinus, and then the duct, that's the conducting portion, whatever those secretions are going to be. And so here's our exocrine gland. So we have this nice fibrous capsule that goes around it. And then that fibrous capsule, all right, starts to push into the internal portion. And it's these little partitions, these are called septa. And it'll partition parts of the gland off into lobes, all right, these little sections here. All right, so let's talk about the three types of classifications for the exocrine glands. And when we talk about the three types, we're going to classify these glands by how they secrete. So that means we're going to discuss the physiology, the how. Okay, and we'll write out the whole thing. All right, we're going to describe it. I almost made it. We're going to talk about the physio. The first one are the Apricorn glands. These glands, pretty basic. We talked before about how certain cells can make vesicles, and they can make secretory vesicles to secrete whatever that cell is made into the interstitial space or the extracellular compartment there. So Apricorn glands are the glands that do this. Their cells package their secretions into these vesicles. The vesicle will then undergo exocytosis. You should remember what that is. That's when the vesicle fuses with the plasma membrane and it'll release the contents outside of the cell. And you can see all these different glands that do that. The tear glands in your eye, your lacrimal glands, your salivary glands, some of your sweat glands, not all, some, right? Exocrine glands of the pancreas, which we'll talk more about in 211. And then some of the gastric glands of your stomach that are going to produce some of the secretions that help to break down, all right, whatever you've ingested. So let me show you a picture of the Apricorn glands. Here's a picture of our Apricorn gland all the way on the left of the screen here. So here's the gland itself. It's packaging up its secretions into these secretory vesicles, and then it's expelling the contents here into the center of the acini, and then eventually, all right, it'll conduct the secretions through the duct and out onto the epithelial surface there. All right, and again, we can see that example here in the salivary glands, sweat glands, your lacrimal glands. All right, the second type of gland is the apricorn gland. Now, the only person that I know for sure in this class section that kind of knows what I'm talking about, because they might be a little bit closer in age to me than some, is David. All right, you're familiar probably with the lava lamp, and I'm sure a lot of you are too. All right, but I remember lava lamps were quite popular, 60s and 70s, possibly even the 80s. I think they're making a resurgence now. But that's what I think about with this type of gland. Okay, the apricorn gland, the first three letters are apo. So think of, all right, the apical surface. So basically, the top part of the cell, right, is going to pinch off. All right, and that's going to include some of the cytoplasm. And that's what becomes the secretion. Okay, that's what the secretion becomes. And so it releases, all right, the apical membrane and parts of the cytoplasm, all right, again, like exocytosis, pinches off, secretes it outside the cell, and eventually it goes onto the apical surface here. All right, so we see that in the mammary gland, some of your sweat glands in pubic area regions, like areas that become active during puberty where you get pubic hair growth. That's how I remember it. All right, apricorn begins with an A, so does axillary. So that's when you start to get armpit hair, okay? So when you start to grow pubic hair in those regions, right, that's when these glands become active. All right, so we'll see them affiliated with hair. So here's a quick picture. Here's our apricorn gland in the center. And so you can see that the apical surface of a lot of these cells, and again, it looks like, all right, a lava lamp, this big glob will pinch off and then it'll float up. I shouldn't make it sound like it's floating like a balloon, but it'll move up into the duct and then out into the epithelial surface there. But so this type of secretion is going to be a little bit thicker, all right, than this type of secretion, because it will have, all right, part of the plasma membrane and the cytoplasm there. Okay, so the goo of the cell and the plasma membrane is made up of phospholipids and proteins, so it'll be a little bit thicker. And you've already heard, some of you may know, all right, that breast milk, all right, is going to be rich in lipids and proteins. Well, yeah, all right, because it's getting that material from part of the plasma membrane that got pinched off into the secretion of the cell. Okay, our last type of cell is the holocrine gland. Now, I think of Holocaust. You know, you may have heard of the nuclear Holocaust, and you know, and so which is complete destruction. Well, that's what happens with this cell. Okay, so with the holocrine glands, the cells, all right, produce whatever their secretion, and then the cell just blows up. Okay, disintegrates, and so the parts of the cell that were destroyed and whatever it was making, all of that becomes the secretion. Then eventually those cells that were destroyed get replaced. So the contents of this secretion are going to be really thick because it's going to include pretty much the whole cell, all right, which has lots of stuff in it, okay, and part of the secretions there. So we see this with the sebaceous glands, and those are those oily producing glands in your face, for example. See quite a bit of that. But they're going to be affiliated with hair. Okay, the sebaceous glands sit right on hair. So that's what we're seeing here in this last slide here, all the way to our right. Okay, you can see the whole cell is just is disintegrating, and the whatever it was making, and the remnants of the cell are going up to the epithelial surface there. All right, so this slide is just basically just a quick review. Okay, so Apricorn glands, they package their secretions into vesicles, and it releases the contents through exocytosis. With Apricorn glands, they're going to pinch off top part of the apical membrane, and whatever secretions it was making in the apical membrane that got pinched off becomes a secretion. And then the holocrine gland is the gland, and is the cell that just blows up. After it's made its secretion, the whole cell just blows up, and so it's going to be quite thick. All right, that's it for the epithelium. Again, I told you that's kind of like a review, so a lot of that should look familiar to you. Okay, so if you were kind of unsure about a couple things, I hope some of that material became a little bit clearer in covering that material here for lecture. All right, so on to the second type of onto the second type of tissue in your body. Epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. So this slide, I believe I've showed you this before. Connective tissue is going to be very diverse, and we're going to have a lot of it throughout the body. All right, so it plays several different roles, some of which are support, protection, and binding of organs. So we'll see it all over the place. Tendons and ligaments, all right, our fat, our cartilage and bone, and our fluid connective tissue is going to be blood, okay? So there's three types of connective tissue, and I'll talk about that in a second here, but all connective tissue comes from mesenchyme. That's the embryonic stem cell tissue. And to a certain degree, all right, connective tissue is going to have some vascularity, which means, all right, it is going to show, all right, how some types of tissue may hardly have any type of blood flow, and others have a lot of blood flow. And then also there's, of course, all right, our connective tissue that is avascular, and our mature cartilage falls into that category. Mature cartilage, mind you. Okay, immature cartilage, not so much. All right, so here are some of the functions. All right, protection, support structure, binding of structures, storage, transport, and immune protection. Storage and transport, especially storage when we get into adipose tissue, energy storage. All right, reticular tissue, again, is going to store cells. Okay, transport, fluid connective tissue all day long. All right, and then with our immune protection, all right, we'll see how that certain white blood cells are going to be in quite abundance in some of these connective tissues. Now, I'm not going to go through all the different types of cells. We already did that before. All right, I'm going to just jump right in and talk about the connective tissue here. So again, here's another figure for you, figure 5.9. All right, this is showing you the breakdown and how we classify the connective tissue. Of course, all connective tissue comes from mesenchyme. And then there's three types of connective tissue. All right, you have your connective tissue proper. The second type is supporting connective tissue. Our third type is going to be fluid connective tissue. And then, of course, we'll break down, all right, the first two types of connective tissue into subcategories. If we're talking about connective tissue proper, we have loose and dense connective tissue proper. And then for our supporting connective tissue, we have cartilage and bone. And then there's subtypes of that, which is cool. All right, so let's quickly review. All right, first type of connective tissue is connective tissue proper. So there's two types, loose and dense, right? And as the name implies, loose connective tissue, there's a lot of space there. We have tons of ground substance. But what we don't have a lot of are cells and protein fibers. So remember, there's three components, okay, three, mind you, components to connective tissue. The first are going to be cells. The second, going to be protein fibers. And the third is going to be, ground substance. And the last two, all right, when we put them together, we call that extracellular matrix. Okay, so the protein fibers and the ground substance make up the extracellular matrix, right, of connective tissue. So when we're talking about loose connective tissue, we won't have a lot of cells, and we won't have a lot of protein fibers. And what protein fibers we have, it's just going to be haphazardly arranged. So you've heard me talk about this before, that this loose connective tissue, right, is often referred to as the body's packing material, find in areas just to fill some space, okay, or to help support some of the internal organs and structures. So we have three types: areolar, adipose, and reticular. So areolar, okay, areolar will have both collagen and elastic fibers, but again, no discernible organization there. Has lots of ground substance, right? Because it has lots of ground substance, a lot of space, that means we'll have a lot of blood vessels. Okay, so of course, we're going to find this in our dermis, right? Actually, in the papillary layer, which is that layer that's immediately deep to the epidermis, which is perfect because the epidermis is avascular because it's made up of epithelial tissue. So how does epithelial tissue get nutrition? Through diffusion. And so we pipe in our blood vessels as close to that tissue as we can through this loose connective tissue, the areolar connective tissue. All right. You'll also see in the subcutaneous layer, it's not a part of the integument, it sits deep to the dermis there. And then again, I said it was like packing material, so we'll find it around some of the internal organs there, around some of our nerve and muscle cells, and we'll even find it around our blood vessels. All right, second type of connective tissue is adipose tissue, okay? We call it fat. Predominant cell type is going to be the adipocyte. And that's going to be the cell that is going to have the lipids stored. Remember lipids, right? Those are our fats. And so we're going to store lipids in those cells because we need that energy for later on. All right, so there's two types of fat, or white and brown. Okay, we talk mostly about the white. Okay, but that's the one that acts as the energy, the stored energy, the triglycerides there. All right. Also, you'll notice that it'll offer insulation, help keep you warm. Okay, and it'll cushion. We'll find it around certain organs. Your kidneys are a perfect example because you have this fat tissue around it. It's called perirenal fat, and it helps to cushion the kidneys. The brown adipose tissue we see in newborns. Again, that helps to keep it warm. All right. The next type of loose connective tissue is going to be the reticular connective tissue. All right. So pretty much you're going to find in reticular connective tissue, the predominant protein type is going to be protein fiber type, or the reticular fibers, along with the fibroblasts, because they make the reticular fibers. And so between those two guys, they make the rooms at the hotel right here. So think of reticular connective tissue like a hotel, and the leukocytes, which are our white blood cells, live in them. Stay in the rooms for a while, hang out there, then go out for a walk. It'll go through the bloodstream or through the lymphatic system, and then they'll wind back up into some reticular connective tissue somewhere. So where do we find this connective tissue? Throughout our lymphatic organ system. All right, so lymph nodes, bone marrow. Actually, bone marrow is the primary lymphatic organ of the lymphatic system. and then the spleen and the thymus. Those are secondary organs. All right, but think of reticular connective tissue just as this, like the hotel where leukocytes, these white blood cells, will come and stay for a little bit. The other type of connective tissue proper is the dense. And again, there's 3 types. So as the name implies, dense, right? It's going to be tightly packed. So that means that the majority of this type of tissue is going to be made up of the protein fibers. Specifically, collagen is going to be the big one there. You can have some elastic in there too. Okay, so there's hardly any ground substance. Okay, so there's 3 types: dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. The dense regular, this is the one I was telling you about. It looks like lasagna noodles because all those collagen fibers are parallel and tightly packed with one another. And which is great because this type of connective tissue can really withstand stresses in one single direction. So that's why tendons and ligaments are wonderful, because most of those tissues can withstand uni or single direction forces. And it makes it quite strong. But because there's so little ground substance there, so little space, there's hardly any blood vessels that go to this type of tissue. Hence, that's why it takes a long time, because blood helps the healing process. Always, always, always. All right, the next type of connective tissue is going to be the dense irregular. So in this situation, we don't have the fibers, the collagen fibers laying parallel to one another and tightly packed. They're now in a more of a clumpy-like type of configuration. And it goes in all these different directions, which is wonderful because of that, that means that this type of tissue can withstand stress in many different directions. That's wonderful because we like that to be attached to our skin, because our skin can get pulled on in different directions. The periosteum of the bone, which is that outer covering around bones, right, that we attach tendons and ligaments to. We also have a nice covering around cartilage. We call that perichondrium. And then, like I mentioned before, right, a lot of our internal organs will have capsules. And these are going to make up the tissue for those capsules. Now, the nice thing about this dense irregular connective tissue is it has a little bit more ground substance than its buddy dense connective tissue, or dense regular connective tissue, excuse me. So it's going to be, it's going to have more blood flow there. It's going to be more vascularized. Some would even describe it as being highly vascularized. And our last type of dense connective tissue is elastic connective tissue. Obviously, the predominant type of protein fiber in this is going to be the elastic fiber, because this type of tissue is going to stretch and recoil. So you're going to find it in areas that will have to expand and contract. So the walls of blood vessels, specifically the arteries, right, large arteries, your trachea, and your vocal cords. All right, that is the first type of connective tissue. All right, which was our connective tissue proper. I'm going to start talking about our supporting connective tissue. Okay, I probably won't finish it today, but let's start. Again, some of this should be review for you. Okay, so there's 2 types of our supporting connective tissue: cartilage and bone. All right, so we know some of the obvious differences between cartilage and bone. I'm going to go into a little bit more of the physiological differences. Right, we know cartilage is going to be firm. It's going to be tough. We've seen it because, well, the tip of our nose is cartilaginous, and that's kind of solid. All right, but it bends a little bit. So cartilage is going to have a little bit more flexibility than bone if we're comparing the 2. So cartilage, we're going to have both collagen and the elastic protein fibers. All right, so the more elastic protein fibers you have, the more flexible cartilage will be. The predominant cell type in cartilage is going to be the chondrocyte. Now, that's the mature cell. Okay, when they're baby cells, we call those chondroblasts. We'll talk about that in chapter 7 later on. Okay, but the mature cell, it's all grown up, are the chondrocytes. And when they get mature and they're all grown up, they decide to live on their own. And that's what they do. They live on their own in these small spaces called lacuna. All right, lacuna matata, as the Lion King would say. Okay, So these mature chondrocytes stay and live in the lacuna, and they just maintain the cartilage matrix there. And again, we'll talk about that later on in a different chapter. So certain types of cartilage will be covered by a dense irregular connective tissue. All right, and we call that perichondrium. Perichondrium has two layers. I haven't mentioned this before. It has what we call the outer fibrous layer. That's the tough layer. Okay, that's where if something needs to attach to the cartilage, it'll attach onto the outer fibrous layer of the perichondrium. Now the inner layer, that's where we call that the intercellular layer, because we start to produce cells that are called the chondroblasts. Those are the baby cells, and they're going to grow up to become chondrocytes. And we'll talk about that. Okay, but that's on the inside. The fibrous outer layer of the perichondrium is on the outside. Perichondrium, two layers. Same for bone. All right, the outer covering of bone is called the periosteum. Same thing. Okay, so cartilage is tough. It's really strong. All right, so that's why we classify it as supporting connective tissue, because it can help support structures. All right, like I said before, right, there's higher elastic protein fiber content to it, but also has a little bit more of a water content, which gives it more flexibility than bone. All right, but key point, mature cartilage is avascular. That's a great test question. Okay, so true or false, cartilage is avascular, and they would have to say mature cartilage is avascular. All right, so there's three types: hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, elastic cartilage. The first type is the most common type, right? This type does have a perichondrium surrounding it, that two-layer structure. So you're going to see this, and I mentioned this before, the tip of your nose, all right, those rings that go around your trachea, all right, your larynx, your voice box there, at the ends of your ribs, where the ribs attach onto your sternum there, along the ends of the long bones there, what we call the articular ends, and the articular ends refer to where two bones will touch each other. Okay, so where they're connecting to one another, each of those ends of those long bones will have this type of cartilage on the ends there. And then before your skeleton becomes bone, all right, it starts off as a hyaline cartilage skeleton, and then it transitions over into a bony skeleton. The second type of cartilage is fibrocartilage. This is one of my favorites. Fibrocartilage is tough. This one does not have a perichondrium. Okay, and it's tough because, well, one, there's hardly any ground substance, and the majority of the tissue, all right, or I shouldn't say the tissue, the majority of the substance in this type of connective tissue are going to be the protein fibers, those collagen and those elastic fibers, mainly collagen fibers, right, which makes sense because you're going to find this tissue in weight-bearing areas, like in your spine, those discs there, okay? Also, you'll find it in the menisci of your knees there, okay? And so it helps to resist compression. All right, and then finally, the last type of cartilage is the elastic cartilage. And it's, again, you look at the name elastic, so you think stretch and recoil, all right? This is going to be a springy, flexible type of cartilage, all right? But the nice thing about this type of cartilage, it has tons of elastic fibers densely packed, so it gives it that flexibility, but also gives it its resiliency, that toughness there. All right, so we're going to see this on the pinna there, the external portion of your ear and your epiglottis, because those can be subjected to mechanical forces, like if you are scratching your ear and you're pulling it forward or whatever, it'll spring back to its original position there. But it does, again, have a perichondrium, an outer layer, not an outer layer, an outer covering made up of two layers. And the chondrocyte, again, will be the predominant cell type in this type of tissue, but in this tissue, you'll see that those cells are packed in very tightly. And that's our elastic cartilage. Okay, so this is a good place to stop here. I've gotten quite far, and I know that probably a bunch of you are probably zoning out on me. So let's stop here. Okay, we'll take a 15-minute break. And then what we'll do